head honcho
I want him to talk on it, and let him talk, y'all. Let him talk.
And now, what's your name, ma'am? What's your name?
You can call me Taylor.
Taylor. Okay, you're a Caucasian woman, right?
Yes, I consider myself a foundational white American.
Okay, there you go. Foundation to where, though? That's very interesting.
To American, just like there are foundational black Americans.
But no, we didn't immigrate anywhere. As a white person, you had to immigrate. You had to immigrate from somewhere.
Well, I mean, in the same vein, would you say that about black people, since genetically they're closely related to Africans?
No, everybody's
like
African.
I said,
everybody's
I would
African.
consider myself a foundational white American because my white ancestors did build this country. They were the ones that set up the structure, the administration, everything. I mean, they are the founders of the American philosophy. So I would consider my white ancestors the foundation of American culture and American, really anything.
But when they
even when it comes to managing the labor of other groups, they were the ones who were doing the management.
Right. But when they tried to do it by themselves, they failed repeatedly.
Well, that's in the nature of other groups as well.
Okay. So, yeah, it's hard to say that they're foundational. Well, yeah, they dominate everything. I'll give you that. They do dominate. They do that. And that's global. They control the entire planet. So I will give you that. That's what white supremacy is. Wait, somebody said, is there doubt that they control the entire planet?
Yeah, at least where I'm from. But I was about to say these are the white people that signed.
Oh my God. You don't think they control Somalia?
Tariq, calm down. I was about to say those are the white people, cinemas people.
I just want to hear Tariq's philosophy. That is my question, because this is the first time I'm hearing about this sort of philosophy straight from one of the main, if not the main person who led the whole philosophy.
Right.
So I would rather just hear it from him.
Right. Now, the young lady, the foundational white girl, your parents immigrated from where? They had to immigrate somewhere.
They were born in America.
Your parents immigrated from where to America?
No, they were born here. They didn't immigrate. And
white people are not indigenous
can be traced all the way back to the 17th century. Back to 17th century.
White people are not indigenous to America at all, ma'am.
They have been. I mean, it's archaeologically proven as well. I mean, we go all the way back to Leif Erikson. And I do have Scandinavian blood at that.
And Leif Erikson went up there to Canada and went back. He didn't have offspring, so there was no white offspring.
Well, there were other people with him as well.
But they didn't stay up there in Canada.
I'm not sure if there's any mainstream historical record of it. But like I said, my concern isn't with the
Leif Erikson went back. Leif Erikson went up to Canada and went back.
I know my history.
But I'm asking you where you immigrated from. This is ma'am. Why are you getting defensive over a simple question?
The black community.
Why are you getting defensive over a very simple question, ma'am?
I'm not defensive at all. I'm just.
I asked you where your family immigrated from, and now you kind of started trolling. Are you ashamed of the place you came from in Europe?
No, not at all. I'm not ashamed of anything. I know my ancestors very well.
Did they immigrate before or after the Black Plague?
Before.
The Black Plague.
Okay.
Because your family.
I mean, simply nobody immigrated. We're all
family. It was up there in Europe dying off. So I just want to know
facts.
When they had to flee. They were up there dying off in Europe.
Yeah.
And by the way, they were dying off in the North American continent until Black Americans.
Yes, sir. And they fled.
Not necessarily. I would say it was the other way around, considering that it was frankly, I hate to disparage my ancestors like this, but frankly, it was European. Diseases that killed off the native population.
They didn't kill all of them off because we're still here. Black people were indigenous to this land, so we're still here.
But it was the main force behind.
Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. This episode will be part 3 to America's white slaves. Now, in previous videos, we talked about the head right system and the law of transportation, which stems from the Enclosure Act, which took place in Europe, where the powers that be over there made poor people out of the masses. So we're going to see what the books say about that. Also, we're going to go into the books and get a timeline of how long the white slave trade in America occurred and what it took to stop it. We also going to look in the books to see what it says about white slavery being covered up by historians. So right here is talking about what was going on in Europe or in England prior to the development of the head right system and the law of transportation. In 19th century England, tens of thousands of white children were employed as slave laborers in British coal mines. Little white boys, 7 years old, were harnessed like donkeys to coal carts in order to drag them through the mine shafts. In 1843, white children aged 4 were working in the coal pits. In old English cemeteries can be seen epitaphs on gravestones like one which reads, William Smith, age 8 years, minor, died 1841. The root of the Holocaust against the white yeomanry of Britain lies in the history of the land swindles perpetrated against them in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. As the lords obtained their rights against the king as formalized in the Magna Carta, they used them to expropriate the land rights of the Yemen by means of the writ of novel dissecin that what historian Rodney Houghton describes as another lawyer's trap. Ownership was transferred to the lords. The people were allowed to remain on their ancestral lands with something akin to a sharecropper's status. By the 17th century, even this tendency was being eroded by the introduction of the enclosure laws, which fenced off land that was formerly farmed in common by the people, as the landlords began to enforce their property rights. The net effect of enclosure, though it was at first slow in coming, was the eviction of the people from the land, a process begun towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, necessitating the first poor relief law for able-bodied unemployed persons known as the 43rd Elizabeth. Okay, so that was the enclosure that brought about head right and law of transportation. So the Enclosure Act of the 17th century that took the land from the people over there in Europe led to this right here. It says the kidnapping of English children into slavery in America was actually legalized during the first quarter of the 17th century. In that period, a large number of the children of poor parents, as well as orphan children, were targeted for the white slave trade. These poor white children were described as a plague and as a rowdy element. Now, the legalizing of kidnapping of children led to them being transported to America. So it says the official papers of the white slave trade refer to adult white slaves as freight, and white children slaves were termed half freight. Like any other commodity on the shipping inventories, white human beings were seen strictly in terms of market economics by merchants. The American colonies prospered through the use of white slaves, which Virginia planter John Prory declared in 1619 were our principal wealth. Now, here's a comparison to what they said they used scripture or biblical justification to enslave so-called black people with the curse of Ham, right? So right here it says biblically provisions for bound and hired labor were cited to justify white slavery in early America on the grounds that it was scriptural and therefore humane. Now, remember they said how so-called black people would escape the South to the North where slavery was outlawed? Okay, right here it says in the 18th century, many runaway white slaves headed for crowded cities like Philadelphia and New York that offered anonymity, in which places no questions are asked, as one white runaway put it. Taverns in northern colonial cities were famous as places that concealed fugitive white slaves. Now, right here, we're going to go into how long white slavery was allowed to last in the United States. It says the claims of masters in one colony upon the fugitive white slaves in another jurisdiction were allowed from the beginning of colonial settlement in America, meaning that your runaway slave couldn't run away to another colony and be accepted. And then after the so-called Revolutionary War, says the U.S. Constitution upheld the colonial fugitive white slave laws in its Article 4, Section 2. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on a claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So right there in the Constitution, white slavery was allowed to persist. It says this law was enacted by whites against fellow white people and allowed white slavery to continue in some parts of America right up until the Civil War. So the Emancipation Proclamation was to free white slaves. It goes on to say the first legal blow to the system of white bondage didn't occur until 1821, when an Indiana court began to enforce the ordinance of 1787, prohibiting white slavery in the old Northwest Territory. So basically, what they're saying is that in 1787, they passed a law in the Northwest Territory to outlaw white slavery. Now, what was going on in 1787 was the Northwest Indian Wars, particularly in Ohio, East Pennsylvania, and Indiana, and maybe North Kentucky. So 2 years into the Northwest Indian Wars that lasted a whole 10 years from 1785 to 1795. 2 years into that war with Indians inland, because that would have been inland, the places where they were lumping the refuse of white slaves, they were humping them to the back country into inland. Inland at the time would have been East Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. And if you go down, it would have been West Virginia at the time and East Tennessee. So 2 years into that war, they passed the ordinance prohibiting white slavery in the old Northwest Territory. And then again, 2 years into the so-called Civil War in 1863, they passed the Emancipation Proclamation. So understand how those two connect. Now in the book right here, White Cargo, is talking about how it would take 30 years before the indentured servant trade disappeared. And it also says it did so as unobtrusively as it came in, dying out slowly and without fuss. No principled campaign was fought to end it, as happened with black slavery. So the fact that he put that like that tells me it's a lie. But down here it says by 1820, the trade was gone, and those who connived at it, some of them great names in America and Britain, were remembered for other things. So it's saying it died out in 1820. But on another page of that book, it's talking about them running away. So it says the runaway is one of the constants throughout the history of American servitude. From the dreaded days of Sir Thomas Dale, men and women were slipping away in the forests or taken to the water in the hope of finding refuge with Native Americans or losing themselves in another colony. They would continue to do so long after the English period and up until the American Civil War. Now, it would seem that the Civil War ended white slavery, right? But right here it says the enslavement of whites in one form or another has proved very durable. Bound white servitude for orphans and destitute children on contracts of indenture still occurred in New York State as recently as 1923. And then right here from that book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, it says a childhood in the factory. The British and American factory system of the Industrial Revolution was staffed mainly by enslaved, indentured white children who were forced to work as children had never worked before. 16-hour days locked into a building without breaks, except to go to the necessary. Food was taken standing up while tending the primitive machinery, which mutilated tens of thousands of children. For falling asleep or talking, white girls and boys were beaten with a leather strap or a billy roller, a murderous iron bar. The photograph above is of American girls who worked a 70-hour week at a factory in South Carolina in the early 1900s. Now, it seems that since white slavery continued after the Civil War, that the Civil War was the deciding factor that so-called Indian, black, Negroes, or coloreds wasn't going to be owning any more white slaves. But right here, it describes in 1666 about an old white slave called Old John that was beaten to death for stealing a piece of bread. It says that in 1666, Old John was beaten for stealing a piece of bread. He ran away but returned to the plantation. Citing the 60-year-old as a runaway, Smith took him to the constable, Captain Bowman. Now, Bowman, a man with a bow, okay, who may that be? For the statutory punishment for runaways, up to 30 strokes of the whip. Bowman saw bruising on Old John's arm and remarked that the man looked more in need of a nurse than a whipping. He refused to administer the punishment. An infuriated Smith took Butts home, where he could cut off one side of the servant's hair to mark him as a runaway, stripped him, and began to whip him. 2 other servants watched and counted 40 or 50 lashes before their master stopped. Smith then put a plow chain around Old John's ankle and forced him to work by day and grind corn by night. He continued to thrash him. About 3 weeks after the visit to Captain Bowman, Old John died while sleeping in an open tobacco house. The local justices found that Smith had beaten Butts in contempt of justice, but because the relevant records did not survive the American Civil War, we don't know if Smith was ever tried for murder. Now, right there, it's saying that the records did not survive the American Civil War. In the past, I did videos and showed how they were going around during the Civil War destroying records. And being one-track minded at the time, I always thought that it was to conceal the fact that the records exposed the Aboriginals' true identity, their true nationality. But now, along with that, I believe that they were covering up the existence of white slavery and possibly the existence of Aboriginal ownership of white slaves. Now, here it's talking about the cover up. It says Professor Hanlon informs us that legislatures in Virginia sought to cover up the record of white bondage and its equivalent to Negro servitude. The compiler of the Virginia laws codifying black slavery for the first time then takes the liberty of altering texts to bring earlier legislation into line with his own new notions. For examples of alterations to insert the word slave as a reference to blacks in Virginia when it had not been used to describe them that way before. When it had not been used to describe them that way before. What was it later lawmakers sought to cover up? The fact that the white ruling class of colonial America had cast their own white people into the same condition as blacks, or even worse. It says Richard Legan's eyewitnesses reported of a white slave revolt in Barbados in 1649 has been regularly referred to down through the years by at least a dozen later historians, including Poyer, Old Mixon, and Schomburg, as a rebellion of Negro slaves. Let me repeat that. Richard Legan's eyewitness report of a white slave revolt in Barbados has been regularly referred to down through the years by at least a dozen later historians as a rebellion of Negro slaves. Right here it's talking about how it was covered up. It says crackers, red legs, rednecks, and hillbillies. They call them red legs because when they was out there slaving in the sun, their legs would be turning red. The whole apparatus of the institution of human slavery in English-speaking America, which has been serially memorialized in the voluminous literature on Negro slavery, was first put into place in the enslavement of whites who were kidnapped in their native land, died on board ship, suffered child slavery and separation of parents from children forever, endured fugitive slave laws, the banning of white slave meetings, and severe and extreme corporal punishment, sometimes unto death. The motivation for the cover-up of the extent of white slavery by establishment-funded and approved house scholars is obvious. To admit the true history of white slavery and record it faithfully in modern history is to furnish empirical evidence that white skin does not necessarily embody power or status, that the poor white redneck of today who is asked to subsidize with his taxes and make sacrifices in his living wage and job prospects so that blacks may be compensated for slavery, in reality owes nobody for anything. Okay, that's what it's saying. But right there it said they covered it up. So if they covered that up, what else? Right here it says a 1679 colonial census of whites who fled slavery to scratch out an existence as subsistence and tenant farmers shows that they had to flee to the worst land where they existed in extreme poverty, forming Yemen peasant communities in the hills. It is instructive to note that this white imagery was mocked and scorned by both the wealthy white planter elite as well as the Negroes. So right here, it goes on to talk about the cover-up. It says, not only white slaves were brutalized, but also those who dared to aid them in gaining their freedom. The image of fugitive white slaves being hunted, whipped, and jailed, and the same treatment being accorded those who assisted fellow whites out of slavery is completely absent from modern textbooks' accounts of American history. Yet even as late as the mid-18th century of 1724 wanted notices for fugitives from servitude, the great majority were white indentured servants. Lastly, right here, it's also talking about the cover-up. It says, it is a travesty of historiography that out of deference to the vast political house of cards that has been built upon the myth that only blacks were merchandised in the Atlantic slave trade, historians have failed to consistently describe white chattel by the scientifically accurate term for their condition, that of slave. By avoiding this description, many academics have perpetuated the propaganda through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?